Hello and welcome to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. My guest today is a millennial writer, marketing consultant and founder of Seaforth Creative Group, a consultancy that helps events and media companies get more strategic business impact from their existing content, data and communities. He's also currently ghostwriting a non-fiction book for a business leadership expert. He regularly writes fiction of his own and last year wrote and directed his first short play at a community theatre in London. He's now building a new community for fiction writers set to launch this year. Today, we're going to be talking about generational differences in marketing, the marketing trends being driven by younger generations, and then writing creativity and building communities across generations. So it's really, really exciting to introduce my guest today, Robbie Westacott. Hello, Robbie.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
Great. Lovely to see you. And I think it's fair to say it's taken us a while to get to this podcast, but I know it's going to be worth it because you're bringing a very different approach to the other guests that I've been chatting to, because you're going to be talking about marketing and book writing, which is an area we haven't even gone anywhere near with all of the 40 odd episodes we've had so far. So you're very welcome. And I'd like to start off, if I may. You're a millennial. And, you know, your life has been framed by the way that you were brought up, as my listeners are consistently hearing from me. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing, your background, and who is Robbie, and how did Robbie become the person he is today? And what were those influences around you?
Thanks for having me. Really nice to be here. I was born in 1990, so very much a millennial. I grew up in Wimbledon in southwest London, so a lot of people will probably be familiar with that from the tennis. And went to Wimbledon College, which was a state school and a non-private school, but a great school to go to. And I did English literature and English language. Both were always my strongest subjects in school. And I did both of those at A-level, which is quite unusual. They usually encourage you to only do one or the other, I think, because that probably limits your career prospects. But you know, that was really kind of the only subject I was interested in at school was English and writing and storytelling. So that's kind of where I fell in love with language and communication and all those kind of things. So I think that had a big influence on my life and has kind of led me down the career path that I've taken, and has also kind of led me to where I am today as both a fiction writer and a writer for businesses. I think another big influence on me in terms of, growing up and being in that kind of generation is sport. So my school was very big on sport, and I played a lot of rugby when I was younger and all through my 20s. And I think that kind of probably also shaped me in a way, because it, requires a lot of good communication to play a team sport like rugby. And I think that's something that's also been interesting in my adult life is playing for an adult rugby team, where you're seeing younger generations come through, leaving sixth form, joining the team, having a very different kind of style and approach to playing a team sport like that. And there's definitely some noticeable differences with communication there in that sort of scenario. So yeah, it's really interesting kind of perspective, I suppose, on that.
And we'll certainly look at that a little bit later on when we look at different ways that each generation communicates as we go through the conversation. One thing that struck me is being a rugby player, and the whole thing of competition. Millennials were often, it was suggested that they're the great collaborators because competition wasn't seen as the thing in that time. For example, people, in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, got medals for showing up. It was all about the team and less about winning. But of course, rugby definitely doesn't fit into that mold, does it? So how do you balance that collaborative approach, which you clearly have in the work that you do today, but in a hugely competitive environment of rugby?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I don't know if I necessarily would resonate with that. I think rugby is a game of real team values and a real team sport. But you're right in terms of, it is fiercely competitive. And I think it's because it's a physical contact sport, and then there's a lot of intensity involved. I think it drives people within the team to be quite, very direct with each other, very sort of hard on each other if things aren't going well, and you have to reach a certain emotional level in order to perform at that kind of physical intensity level. So it's an interesting one, but I also think it's such a key. And we'll get into this kind of topic more as we go through, some of the other questions. But it's so important to communicate clearly and communicate well in team sports like that. So I think that's an important part of it as well. Is recognizing the ways in which people like to be communicated with, or the types of communication styles different age groups, different generations, different backgrounds respond well to. I think that's an also important skill to have. That's helped me at least.
And when it comes to, your choice in going into English, being a wordsmith, as it were, at a younger age, were you a bit of an outlier with that, or were there many other people in your cohort who were interested? Because to me, the initial thought is someone who's a wordsmith, someone very creative, someone who's looking at that stuff, the psychology, if you like, which is involved in marketing and so on. And that and rugby, yes, there are similarities, but I can't imagine there are that many rugby players who pursued the same career choice as you.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. You're right. It is quite a strange mix, I suppose, that creative side and then the sporty side. I must admit, though, I think a big part of the reason I played rugby, and loved it so much is more the sort of the social aspect. I didn't play to an amazingly high level, but it was more about, building those bonds with people, having, a great fun game like out on the pitch, and then those kind of relationships and experiences afterwards in terms of socializing and so on. It's a great sport for that as well. But yeah, you're right in terms of the creative interests and the career I've pursued is quite unusual. Like particularly in my sort of group of friends and things like that. I don't know many people in real life, shall we say, that do what I do. So yeah, it's a strange one perhaps.
And going to university, if I'm right, if I've got my calculations right, you were one of the first cohort who had to pay tuition fees. And that must have been, being on that cusp of that era must have been quite an interesting time, going through those studies and facing, a different way of going through university than previous generations before you.
Yeah, I must admit, I don't really recall a huge amount of that in terms of an influence on my experience there. I think we were just before the introduction of the ridiculously high tuition fees.
Right.
So my age group was still, I think it was £3,000, something like that a year, or does that sound about right? I'm not sure, but it's been a while.
No, you're right. And there's still a cultural change, though, in terms of when you went to university, because, of course, the generation before you were going through and they were actually getting grants. It was all paid for. And, it was a different kind of framework. And also your generation, the amount of people who are going to university really stepped up. The percentages from the 80s to the noughties, effectively we went from 15% going to university to ultimately nowadays you've got up to 50% going to university. So a very different, sort of university backdrop. But let's move on to the marketing side. What got you into marketing? Was that a natural progression from studying English?
I wanted to be a writer. First and foremost, when I left university, that's what I knew I wanted to do. I was writing fiction, kind of, bits and pieces whilst at university, and when I left, I didn't know what that would look like career-wise. I mean, my obvious ambition was to, become a novelist and write books and things like that, which is, still part of the process I'm in at the moment. But my thought process was leave university and find a job that will pay me well to write, basically. And that very naturally led me into marketing. There's lots of different ways you could go in terms of a profession. There's journalism, there's copywriting, advertising, marketing, etc. But yeah, it was my love of writing and my desire to do that as a way to earn a living that led me into marketing. Yeah.
And it's really interesting that you're probably one of few people of your generation that have actually been completely driven by one career choice, and you've stuck with it throughout that time, because everything you've done is connected with writing, connected with that creativity. It's just manifested itself in different ways. When you look around your friends who are of a similar age to you, I'm sure quite a few of them are on career 2, 3, 4, or even 5 by now.
Um, that's a really interesting question, because actually, I don't know if it's maybe just my group of friends and I, but it's probably the inverse of that. Most of my
Right.
best friends have been doing the same thing for, yeah, for most of their lives, I think, which is, I don't know if that's unusual. Um,
Well, it does. I
yeah,
tell
I'm
you what
not
it
sure.
does do. It helps me with my myth busting, which is what I love to
Yeah.
do on this podcast. I love to show the fact that people don't necessarily just follow
Mm,
the trend of what people expect of a certain generation.
yeah.
And I think one of my aims and missions is to make people think beyond the stereotype, and you're making us do that. So thank you very much indeed
Well,
for that. So looking at people coming into marketing now, you're obviously a millennial, you're now seeing Gen Z coming into that. How has the environment changed for people coming into marketing today versus when you were in first coming into marketing?
well, I think really interestingly, just on that specific question, for people coming into marketing today, I think we're at a really interesting kind of turning point in a way, because the generations who are entering the workplace for the first time right now are digital natives, and they are the ones who have grown up with the highly advanced technology we are, getting used to today, in terms of the older generations getting used to it, and kind of dealing with that new sort of technology, new way of working. So those younger people who have innate digital skills and are really comfortable with all the technology that's essentially driving so much of marketing and also business on a wider scale, at the moment, in a strange way, if you think about it, they almost have more power than the people who are interviewing them for jobs or looking to hire them, because they are actually so far advanced, purely based on the way they've grown up with the technology that's now in use, and additionally, not just the technology itself, but the kind of the digital world that they occupy, in terms of there's young kids with who are 12, 13 years old with YouTube channels that have millions and millions of subscribers. And in the current marketing landscape, that kind of audience, size and loyalty and kind of personal brand, recognition and equity is so important, because you're trying to capture people's attention and retain it as a marketing person, and you've got this kind of fearless younger generation who have no reservations with going on camera and recording like video content, for the millions of people online. So it's a real like interesting shift in the traditional kind of dynamic of we're a business, we have this brand, it's really you know desirable for you to come and work for us, and us be the ones in control. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see an increasing shift of that power dynamic, where it's like, well, young people are the ones really kind of excelling at all the kind of more innovative marketing skills and practices and so on. And since so much of marketing and business at the moment is done online, I think that's a really interesting trend, for those younger people. It's like a real advantage.
And what about AI? Because they're entering a world. There's been a lot of talk about the creative process and AI, and obviously it's affecting book writing, which we'll come on to in a moment. But even marketing, with copywriting, with journalism, with all of those things. And I have to hold my hands up here. I use AI to write content for me, which in a sense is doing people out of work and stuff. So where do you you see that balance lying? Because on one hand, you could be a little bit of an ostrich with your head buried in the sand saying, no, we'll carry on doing it the way we've always done it. But then you've got people coming in who are going to be adopting this new technology and running with it. And, that's going to create a whole new world in the way that we approach marketing and writing. Well, where do you stand with that discussion?
So from my perspective, it obviously, using digital tools to become more efficient or automate, manual time-consuming processes is, beneficial. And it's important to not be, too resistant to technology. But I do think that, in terms of people's cognitive development, their ability to learn skills and do things like writing, if you're outsourcing that task to AI, then you're not doing that task yourself. You're not either learning how to do it or you're not getting better at it yourself. So then it's kind of, when it comes to writing, the argument is like, well, do human beings still need to write to be able to write well and communicate well? Because writing is largely communication. Yeah, of course they do. And writing improves your communication skills and improves your ability to think, your ability to work through problems and so on. And that process is critical to, your development of opinions and perspectives and so on. So I think outsourcing writing to AI is in many ways a bit of a mistake. Like, yes, it can give you the output much, much faster. And for a lot of people, it can give you maybe a better output depending on your ability to write. But I don't think the outcome is always the 100% of the point with something like writing. I think you're writing to go through the process of thinking through it, to learn, the thing you're writing about better, to develop your own viewpoint on it, to develop your own voice and your own way of thinking. So I do worry a little bit that people are growing up with AI and using that to do all sorts of important, really critical human skills for them before they learn to do them themselves properly. Are going to have, some potential risks when it comes to their development, I suppose. However, having said that, I do understand that there are great benefits to someone, say, for example, if someone's really dyslexic and they just generally struggle to write because, they were born that way, then using AI to help them communicate their valuable knowledge more clearly is obviously a good thing. So I think it's about, a balance between using AI as a tool to help you do things, more effectively or more efficiently, versus actually developing your own critical skills as a human being that you do still need.
And I think many people would agree with you in the principle of that. Learning those skills is really important, and it'll be interesting to see how marketing courses at university, how they change in the world of AI. And, the challenge I guess you have as a marketer, and we'll come on to book writing in a while, but as a marketer, you have a challenge that if you're an organization and you're looking at hiring or using AI, you're not necessarily looking at that purest view of, has this been written with someone's skills? You're just thinking about your output. You're thinking about, what's reaching your clients and your customers and your audience. And is that good enough? And I know that's almost swearing in front of someone who's a creative writer. But I'm just being a bit of a pragmatist, thinking if I'm an organization, I'm looking at my bottom line and costs and so on, that's a very difficult, decision to make, where you're doing the right thing or you're doing the express thing, which is going to save you a lot of time and money and resources. And I know that's a provocative point.
Yeah, no, it is. I see your perspective completely. I think we're then kind of veering into questions like quality over quantity, and making the assumption that everything AI produces is actually good enough to publish, which in many cases it isn't. There's a very cliched term now, which is like crap in, crap out when it comes to language models. So I think the other thing that I am seeing, and this is kind of related to what we're talking about in terms of trends and so on, is people of all generations at the moment, I think, are craving, real sort of human authenticity, like real, because there's so much AI generated content on the internet now, and a lot of it is very low quality, and a lot of it is very, robotic and sort of sterile, or very kind of, clearly AI written. I think we're going to see a very big kind of movement for, more human things, because, if something's a commodity, which AI content is now, then, the alternative, the actual, the work that's taken a lot of time and effort and care to produce becomes much, much higher value as well. So, yeah, I don't know, it's an interesting debate for sure.
And actually, what I think is particularly interesting is the element where I would agree with you is there's an element of AI being a bit of a gimmick, using avatars and, things like the ABBA in concert, which is all, done with avatars and things. Yes, it's all very nice, but I think fundamentally I would agree with you that we all crave that real connection with another human being, because we're hardwired to do that. So in that respect, I'm a complete optimist and would agree with you. So let's go on to the writing side of it now. Because clearly, when you look at the different generations, you look at the older generations, baby boomers, probably a little bit more analog in their approach if you go along with the stereotype. And then you sort of get younger and younger and younger, and they become more digital. That's not necessarily the case, but you will have people within that. How are people today approaching writing? You're working with authors and you're working with younger authors. How are you guiding them in a way that they learn the real craft of writing rather than just relying on AI?
Yeah, so I mean, just for a bit of context for the benefit of the audience, as well as writing my own fiction and doing a lot of writing, I actually am now running an online community for fiction writers, and it's designed to help encourage and support and connect writers, and also provide them with the accountability and the consistency and the motivation to achieve their writing goals faster. So we meet, online 4 times a week for online group writing sessions. And in that group, in that community, we have about 40 authors from all over the world, and a real range of ages and generational kind of backgrounds. Like we have, I think our youngest member is 18 or 19, and she's at university, and she's just published her first novel, which is fantastic. And then we have people, who have children who are older than that young girl. So like, it's a really interesting sort of group dynamic. And what's amazing is that everyone is, regardless of age or background or whatever it might be, everyone's bonding over a shared love of writing. And I think from my perspective, it's that love of writing that should drive you to write. You should, okay, it's great to have goals, and it's great to have, pride in your work. But if you don't really love the process of writing, sitting down every day at the desk, even when it feels difficult, and, doing the work and going through that process of, trial and error and honing your craft and, getting the bad ideas down so that you can make them good in the editing process later. If you don't really enjoy that, you probably shouldn't be writing, because, you're not going to get rich as an author these days, unless you're very, very lucky and a very sort of rare kind of 1% or 2% of people who get the mega book deal or whatever it might be. And unfortunately, it's a very difficult, at times very lonely, and very kind of frustrating process to try and write a novel or be a writer, these days online, with all the kind of noise that's going on, and all the plagiarism that's going on, and things like that. So I would say that there are people who love to write, and then there are people who want to be writers, right? And I'm not saying that either is right or wrong, but I do think that if you're writing to try and make loads of money, or to try and get famous, or because you just want to be seen as a writer, it's probably going to be really, really unenjoyable. And if you just outsource it to AI, then you're not writing anyway. So I think
It's
it's
like
the love
many
of the
creative
craft.
professions, isn't it? Yeah, it's the love of the craft, whatever you do. And the reality is that the majority of people who are successful at whatever career path they take, it's the ones who have the true passion for it that tend to do well. What is the difference between, when we look at the generations, is there a difference in the way that they approach their writing, say from someone who's a baby boomer through to somebody like your 18-year-old student? Are they approaching it differently because of the way that they were brought up, their environment, their generation, or is the craft a pretty consistent thing?
No, I'd say my observation, and this is, this is just me. This might not be widely applicable, but based on my experience in my master's degree in creative writing, and also with this writing community I have built now, I think the older generations than me seem to have gone through a process of, they've lived their life, they've had a career, they've had children, they've done a specific job for most of their adult life, and it's kind of later on a lot of people seem to be coming to writing and realizing they have a story to tell, or having an experience or a series of experiences in their lives that they now want to reflect on and process through writing a book or whatever it might be, a memoir or a novel, or maybe they've just had a really successful career and they've done well enough to be able to retire and then write books after they finish work. Whereas there's now, in this sort of younger generation, it seems like a lot of these kids, like I sort of touched on earlier, are much more bold and sort of just ready to just write something or create something, or put themselves out there on social media as a poet or whatever it might be, and just try these things at the same time as trying to get a job and build a career, and having almost like that portfolio career mindset of, well, I'm working in PR and I've just left university, but I've also got a YouTube channel and I talk about crocheting, and I've also written a book somehow. Like, it's like the younger generation certainly feels like more empowered to just do what they want to do, rather than, I think, in previous generations it was more of a rigid like career path where it's expected for you to go in a more traditional route, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's important for all of us who are older to understand that it's a different environment in which youngsters are being brought up in today. And of course, there's the big thing of peer pressure as well. And that's where writing and social media absolutely collide, because, you're competing with everybody else out there for space, for audience and everything else. And it's probably harder than ever in that respect. And, I'd like to talk a little bit about, tips that you have. You've seen people of all ages approach writing in the different styles which you've mentioned, which I think is a really strong observation, and actually links very closely to some of the work that I've done in terms of what I'm seeing different generations approach whatever career path they choose. What tips do you have for somebody who is thinking of getting into writing today? And does that advice change according to your generation?
So are we talking about writing fiction or writing as a career?
Either, either. And if the advice is
So
different, fine too.
yeah, okay. So I think in terms of, I think when, so yeah, I think the answer is different actually, because if you're writing in a business environment, for example, like I've done with marketing, I would say that the emphasis, is always on the audience. Like effective marketing is, you have to be highly, highly audience centric, and empathetic, and prioritize the people you're trying to communicate with, because ultimately marketing is communicating a message to a specific group of people and trying to convince those people to take an action, right? So in the business world, in terms of writing, I think go into it with audience centricity as a real priority, and that kind of comes back to the point about trends with different generations, like communicate, understanding different types of people, different groups of people have different preferences for communication, different ways of thinking, different habits and behaviors and perspectives that need to be tailored to or catered to when you are trying to write for them in a sort of business context, especially with marketing. But then if you're writing fiction, I think it's almost the opposite of that. It's about writing the story that you want to write and being true to yourself and your experiences, your personal perspective. Yes, you still need a lot of empathy and a good understanding of psychology as an author, because you are creating fictional characters that need to feel like real living people, and that requires you to put yourself in the perspectives of lots of different people who are nothing like you in real life. But ultimately, if you are writing a novel or some sort of fictional story, I think it's about, like I said earlier, the process is difficult. There's no guarantee of success, and it's not a quick, easy win to write a good book. So you have to enjoy it, and you have to write the story that you really want to tell and that's unique to you. I think, anyway.
Progressively, the generations are becoming more the gig economy, and I'm always saying that what the young do today will all be doing tomorrow, sort of thing. And it's they lead the way. They always have done. That's the way the youth work, and that's why we get change, and that's why we move ahead and we get progress, because it's usually driven by the young. But do you think there's are you able to be as successful as a writer when you're treating it as a bit of a part-time thing amongst multiple other jobs and careers? Does it maybe make you a better writer because you've got access to different experiences? Or do you think it's something you really need to focus on and be a little bit more driven?
I think that will differ based on the type of person. However, I think there is no hiding, in terms of writing craft. Like, you have to be able to write well, regardless of whether you're doing it full time or if it's, like a part-time passion project. And that only comes from practice, repetition, honing your skills, doing it over and over and over again. And that's why I go back to the point about, you have to really enjoy it, because you can't do something like that, every day without fail, again and again and again for years, unless you do really enjoy it. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. So I think it's important to really focus on your craft. However, I do think, writing is a skill that's applicable in every line of work and in every walk of life, right? That's why I'm so concerned about, people outsourcing it to AI, because if you can't do it well yourself, you're going to struggle in a lot of different places. And again, it's kind of that point about communication. A lot of writing is just communicating an idea or a point or an opinion in written form, and doing it clearly and doing it effectively with good structure and good vocabulary and good, emotional resonance for the target audience. So, I think, it really depends on what you're trying to achieve, like what your goal is. If you do want to become, make a good living from writing, you probably do need to give it most of your attention. But equally, that's not to say you can't, succeed with various different projects, as something you're doing in your spare time, whether that's before work or after work or, whenever. So.
Yeah, it is absolutely horses for courses. And of course, we're seeing generationally people evolve. And, as I said before, people, live in a very different world to the one it was 50 years ago, but are managing and creating it in their own way. Robbie, it's been fantastic talking to you. We're going to put all your links and everything else in the show notes, because I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in finding, that support network for authors, so they don't feel they're quite so much by themselves. And I'm sure the kind of conversations that we've been having are very common in the groups when it comes to approaching writing. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'll be back again in 2 weeks' time, where we'll be talking about another subject and how we can bridge that generation gap. Bye for now. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.